welcome to another episode of the Aether Hour. I'm your host, Dmitriy, joined here by the one and only TruthTeller, whom we have had on previously for two very important episodes. One, of course, on the banking system and its history, and the other episode on communism, Marxism, and its Talmudic roots in the past. So definitely check those previous episodes out. They will be in the description below. Close to 4 hours of very in-depth, detailed discussion. And this is, of course, the capstone episode in which we will discuss the early history of Israel, even some of the prehistory of Zionism, how the Talmudic community and those host states whom they occupied came to this idea that the Jewish people, the so-called Jewish tribes around the world, the Sephardim, the Ashkenazim, need to inherently move to the Holy Land, to Palestine, in order to guarantee their so-called survival. And of course, all the conflicts that came out of that, including, of course, the genocide, which we're witnessing now after the 7th of October, 2023. So without further ado, I just wanted to welcome, of course, TruthTeller. Thank you very much for joining me on this particular episode. I greatly appreciate you coming on. So I don't think we should be spending time introducing you because everybody knows already your input into the community, into the history of this particular criminal organization, almost, we can officially call it. And when we get into the history of the Likud, the Stern Gang, you'll clearly see that the state of Israel emerged from essentially local organized crime of Talmudic Jewish migrants, and some of them were refugees. And this transitioned almost organically into the state of Israel, including some of its highest officials politically and in the military and the IDF. So the origins of this particular tribe, politically and militarily speaking, was in organized crime, including, of course, among terrorists, which, of course, now is completely abhorrent, and terrorism is blamed almost exclusively on Islam. However, as we can see, the 20th century, the terrorism in the early 20th century was almost exclusively Jewish, not just, of course, the bombings in Russia against political figures, police officers, and assassinations carried out against various Tsars and emperors of Russia, and also across all of Europe. These movements for so-called Jewish independence, of course, had their degenerate roots. So maybe, Truth, you can give us sort of the backstory of even pre-Zionism, before Theodor Herzl, some of the ideas that this tribe had, which they, of course, and the fruits that it bore, and how they tried to use the Gentiles in order to push their own agenda.
Sure. Thank you, Dmitry. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone, for being here as well. Yeah, it's been a fascinating topic that, I've delved deep into for a couple of decades now. And I'm still learning more because there's just so many aspects to how this ideology of Zionism as, a precursor or as a big part of a manifestation of Judaism, it absolutely is. And it was also, Judaism also served as the precursor towards communism as well, which would help Jews be able to achieve their call it their manifest destiny to, create homelands that they would control. However, what needs to be understood here is like what their mindset is and how they approach even wanting to, run, say, whether it's an organization or be able to achieve the feats of their ideology. What is it they're willing to expend for this? Because if you looked at how Jews have lived their lives historically with the communities they built in different countries, they've never really sought to just want the homeland just all to themselves, that they would run without, say, any help from they call them the outsiders, the Gentiles, the Goy. No, in fact, they absolutely needed these people to be able to, again, build their infrastructure, build their buildings, build their homes, do their farming, do all their hard labor work, while the Jews would be able to pursue their endeavors of choice, something perhaps in the arts or theater, or, in finance, for instance, they would wish to issue loans at high interest rates. So this way they could live off the residual income earned, rather than say actually earn, a real living. Because again, these people, they're parasitic in nature. They seek to want to own and suck up the assets of the land without actually having to develop it and work hard for it and actually really earn the fruits of their labor. Instead, they just seek to try to earn some sort of passive income while they would then pursue or spend their time doing what it is that, please them, say, their leisure activities, and also, building up their families, building up their communities, and most importantly, preserving their bloodline and adhering to their traditional values. That's always very important to them. But again, within a state segregated from the outsiders, because they're also quite, sensitive, and they don't want, say their own kids and, their own family exposed to, what, say, the Gentile or Goy are up to. So they, in a sense, seek isolation, but again, state within a state. So then if you looked I don't want to go too far into history. I mean, we spoke briefly about, say, Shabbatai Sevi was born in Anatolia in the Ottoman Empire, born Jewish, and he was considered, say, the lost Messiah. At least that's what he led about 50% of Jews at the time to believe. So he had a big following. But then when the Ottoman Empire saw what he was up to, because he was in pursuit of a Jewish homeland, they essentially gave him a choice. By 1666, either you convert to Islam or we're going to kill you. So he decides that he will deceive the leadership of the time and supposedly convert. But then, of course, he still maintained these occultic, ritualistic practices while at the same time, claiming to be Muslim until, he would die. And then his next in line, his successor, Jacob Frank, would emerge, try the same attempts, again, fool the public, fool the masses, claim to convert, while still, maintaining the Jewish practices and traditions that are sacred to them, many of which were occultic, Kabbalistic, and, against obviously the culture of the Ottoman Empire and really any country that would learn of it. And we saw this historically from when the Jews have been kicked out in places like, they were kicked out of Egypt, they've been kicked out of Greece, they've been kicked out of the Roman Empire because they just refused to assimilate themselves and abide by the laws of the land. They've always had this rebellious nature, wanting to do things their way without consideration for, others living within their country. So if we fast forward a little bit, the topic I did want to discuss a little bit more that doesn't really get a lot of attention because there's this misconception that Zionism was somehow just created by, these white European, say Polish or, Eastern European Jews that just want to create a state for themselves. And the only reason why they brought in, say, other Jews from around the world, be it Ethiopian, be it Mizrahi, be it Sephardic, is only because they couldn't make the numbers. But the reality is it was always a collective effort to want to have this Jewish state and sense of identity. Because again, Jews, irrespective of where they were around the world, always tended to get themselves in trouble. And they'd be kicked out of so many different countries, which proves that point. So the one particular individual that I spent a little bit of time, trying to study a little further, and it does merit more study, of course, is, Mordecai Noah, who's from the US. He was an American Jew. And early on, he had a plan to try and establish a Jewish state within America. And he thought he was of the belief system that, hey, it would be a simple task. He could just buy a piece of land and Jews would just assemble there and figure it all out. But in fact, it was a complete fail. This is by 1820, he'd made his proclamation. He actually spent about $17,000, which at that time was, hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more, because the land wasn't valued by as much as it is now. Again, this was at a time when there was no central bank in place either. So somebody fronted him that cash because he didn't come from wealthy means. And again, this was in upstate New York, within an island, isolated. He'd bought about 2,500 acres. And his hope was that Jews from around the world would assemble. But it failed. They didn't show up. And he was around. This was an individual around before the time of Theodore Herzl, before the time, of course, Vladimir Jabotinsky, these other Eastern European Jews. He was a Sephardic Jewish descent, by the way. But he had this legitimate endeavor, and he actually bought a piece of land, and he tried to establish it in New York in 1820, and it failed because the Jews cannot actually build a society or a country from scratch. They just have the desire to want to own one that's already prepared. So when you hear that old saying, a land, it's a land without a people without a land, we know that's a bunch of crap because they already tried to do that same endeavor. They also tried the same thing with the Jewish Oblast in Russia that was given to them by Stalin. Some of them assembled there, but then they quickly realized, we don't want to live on this land on our own and have to do our own farming and do our own, blue collar labor. That's way too much work. Let's find our way back into Russia. And it was the same under the Tsar, after they'd kill Alexander II, they were given the Pale of Settlements, their own land, do what you want with it. They didn't want to live there. So instead, they would pretend to convert to Christianity. They would change their names, as the likes of Leon Trotsky did, Lenin did, Stalin did, and then try to supposedly assimilate themselves, but really just infiltrate and then try to build a community, a rogue community, so this way they could eventually rebel against the establishment. I mean, back then they were a lot more raw and brazen. Now they're a lot more sophisticated and advanced with their methods. They seek to, of course, control politicians, push through laws. They've got a propaganda media complex. They've really gone about indoctrinating the masses to believe in their history, because they do control the media, they do control the textbooks that are published, and they portray themselves out to be these perpetual victims that have been constantly oppressed. But the reality is it's been the Jews that have broken the laws of the land, committed such crimes as child sacrifice, as was the case in 1840, for instance, with the Damascus massacre, which it was the Damascus, I think it was called, in 1840, where the Italian monk and his Muslim servant was killed in Damascus while it was under Ottoman rule. And it was, in fact, the Jews that had done it. and the perpetrators were arrested, and they claimed they were tortured in the confession. The reality is they actually did it. The proof was there. They were tried. An investigation took place. They were tried, and the Jews were punished for it. But then there was this outcry around the world that, well, Jews are being persecuted. They're the victims of oppression, etc., and they need a homeland to be safe. But the reality is that Jews could have always lived safe within any country that they've lived in around the world. It's just always been a choice not to, because they don't want to actually go about a conventional life where they, get up, they, for instance, pursue schooling and then get a job and work and pay taxes and just live normal lives. Well, no, they want to be able to own the businesses, own the infrastructure, own the politicians, own, of course, the monetary policy, own every major facet of society. So this way they're in control and they can commit whatever crimes they want. And we see this time and time again. I mean, the most recent example that I discussed yesterday was this individual, Howard Rubin, who was a famed money manager on Wall Street, made millions of dollars. They're just bored. So what do? He sets up a dungeon in a penthouse in New York and he starts torturing young girls, similar to like what Leo Frank did when he was the manager or a general manager of a pencil factory in Georgia, and also a chapter member of B'nai B'rith. They get bored, they're like, I think I'm going to sacrifice a kid, or I'm going to rape this kid and then kill it, which is what he did with Mary Fagan. So you see this consistent pattern of where Jews will make it to the upper echelons of society, have all this money, and they get bored because I guess the reality is within their faith, they don't have this sense of fulfillment that they achieve, or even this sense of accountability or karma that, hey, if I commit these crimes, I'm going to get judged for this and end up burning in hell. So perhaps maybe live in fear a little bit and avoid committing these crimes and stop being so immoral, stop lying to people and stop, committing this genocide, wiping out women and children. But that, a sense of accountability, a sense of fear, or submission to God, it just isn't there. And that's why they allow themselves to lie, to deceive, to gaslight freely with clear conscience, because according to their belief system, they don't really believe in a heaven or hell. In fact, they want to try to achieve a heaven on the current earth that they live in. So they're not worried about any type of afterlife. And in fact, they try to expand on their lifespans by, again, using, as Jeffrey Epstein's tried to do, as Larry Ellison's tried to do, extend the life of the telomere so this way they can live past 100 or maybe even longer, because according to their belief system, they can maybe reach that life expectancy of 915 years, which is what the life expectancy average was between time of Abraham to time of Moses. So perhaps that might be their expectation. Who knows? Because they're really not fearful of an afterlife that may await them that entails, burning in hell for eternity. So when you don't have that sense of fear in you, what do you have to really lose? When you control the laws of the land, you control, for instance, the prison systems, you control the politicians that make the laws, you control the presidents that can give you pardons, you don't care if you rip off the Gentiles, you don't care if you screw over society. So, what the hell? Why not? So, but their problem was until they achieved a homeland, the issue was that, well, what do? We don't want to end up dealing with any type of consequences. We can't always get away with everything. You know what? We need a homeland. So this way we can run off to a place like, say, Israel, or, if temporarily they had the Jewish Oblast, they tried their thing in New York, failed. So this way we can run away there and avoid prosecution for our crimes. So I fast forwarded a bit, but so we went from, discussing Mordecai Levy, he failed. Then we got briefly into communism, which Communist Manifesto was released in 1848. Again, the idea there was to, invade a homeland country for themselves, replace the establishment and control the means of production and the assets, but hey, employ slave labor through gulags. So again, very similar to Zionism, if you notice, but then they have the slaves in place. So with Palestine, they have the Palestinian slaves in place to do all their dirty work they don't want to do. In Russia, they have their gulags in place, their concentration camps, so they can do all the dirty work like build canals, build roads, build homes and buildings, etc., that they don't want to do themselves, and for basically no cost of labor. You're just feeding them. So that's in 1848 onwards. And then again, we get closer to the time of Theodore Herzl in and around 1897. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there's also the Rothschild component. They were also obviously key Zionists, and they made attempts to try to purchase the land of Palestine from the Ottoman Empire in and around 1827. The first offer was rejected. So this was right after the time of Mordecai Levy. Fast forward to 1896, before the time of Herzl, a second offer is made for around $2 billion cash to purchase the land of Palestine, for the Jews from the Ottoman Empire. Once again, offer rejected. So this whole point that, nothing really happened, but, until the time of Theodore Herzl, and he claims his inspiration was, of course, this event that took place, I think it was around 1894, the Dreyfus Affair. And this is when this Jewish soldier apparently got arrested, prosecuted, convicted for, his espionage activities, giving away state secrets to Germany. And that is what, again, inspired Theodor Herzl to want to pursue, this idea of Zionism. So this way Jews could be protected and not held accountable for espionage, events, which they've, again, been doing for decades upon decades. They've been doing it in America, of course, getting caught. So then, of course, with help of the Rothschilds, he conceives this theology, this idea of Zionism, and then he of course writes it up through the Zionist Manifesto. Sorry, just a couple of things happening. So he again issue this Zionist Manifesto, and then aim to create the World Zionist Council as well, which he does, and then gather Jews from around the world to then pursue the Zionist state. So Herzl only lasted up until in and around 1904. By the way, I've been going on for a bit. Is there something, did you want to chime in, or do you want me to keep going?
No, absolutely. I just wanted to mention, this is, I think, incredibly important, the fact that many people really disconnect the realities of what was happening, say, during the First World War, and of course the setting up of the State of Israel. If you notice, even the dates should give you a hint as to the relationship between even the Bolshevik Revolution, for example, or as some Russians call it, the Bolshevik coup, and the creation of the State of Israel, directly co-linked, even in terms of date-wise, because the Bolsheviks, so Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Sverdlov, their party came to power in Petrograd, the capital of at this time, revolutionary Russia, because again, Freemasons and liberals have already taken over in February, March of 1917. But during the so-called October Revolution, which actually, according to our calendar, which we follow today in the Western world, fell on the 7th of November, 1917. Of course, what was the date of the Balfour Declaration? 2nd of November, 1917. So in this 1 week TruthTeller, a lot of things happened in the world. Coincidentally, Lord Balfour and the Rothschilds, they were already having dealings whilst Lenin and his gang were essentially conducting an operational coup inside of the Russian capital, essentially to take over. It's almost coincidental, right? Because we're still, of course, it's still unknown. And many people are looking back as to exactly where the Bolsheviks received most of their funding from, because clearly they didn't work 9-to-5 jobs. They weren't investors. They weren't wealthy landowners. Most of them received mysterious funding for their propaganda, for spreading their pamphlets, publishing their books abroad and bringing them into Russia in order to create distrust among the common people and throw confusion, and of course spread the ideas of atheism, Bolshevism, and socialistic utopia, right? Which then would, I guess, dilute the Christianity of the local population, and not just Christianity, but other religions as well. In the Soviet Union and later under communism would also be severely damaged. For example, Islam, in which 99% of mosques in the USSR were closed by the late 1970s. Which these are insane statistics, which many people really don't appreciate enough. So clearly, almost every single religion in the USSR suffered from the coming of power, from the time these people came to power. But what's really crucial here is just the co-relationship between, I think, the USSR, the West and the East, to the new State of Israel. And even before Stalin, of course, approved of the State of Israel and essentially sanctioned its creation in this new international rules order, the new international community, to which, by the way, Netanyahu was trying to give a speech to recently, right, in New York, and nobody really listened. But the fact that Netanyahu was even giving a speech in New York, we can almost say that's Stalin's fault. Stalin was the one who helped push the idea of creating a United Nations, creating a post-World War II international rules order. Like, Stalin was a big fan of Roosevelt, right, the president of the US. He was a big fan of the USSR, and Stalin personally, being one of these new world leaders who would define how the world order would be built. So maybe Stalin was, in fact, thinking of some sort of multipolarity, but that's not what happened in the end. What happened was, I guess, the subversive Cold War, which later ended where it did, of course, with our situation today of a huge sway of power in the direction of these Western countries, mostly occupied by liberal, Talmudic, capitalistic ideology, as opposed to communist Marxism. And this is the incredible diversity that the tribe have really invested into. So they, of course, create many different movements into which people can get distracted into, and really philosophers, cultural figures, political figures, they've invested their entire lives into these false teachings, right? Those of Karl Marx or other liberal thinkers. And this, of course, creates further disunity amongst the host nation, in particular in our case, the European peoples, among whom the Ashkenazim actually thrived. And there would have been, look, logically speaking, truth, if not for the misdeeds locally in Europe, there would have been no reason for these people to even want to migrate anywhere. And it's very interesting because if you look at even, for example, the Germans, what was the German attitude, say, before the coming of Adolf Hitler to power and even the Third Reich rising towards the particular tribe? Well, if you look in 1898, I believe it was October, November, Kaiser Wilhelm II, so this is the last German Kaiser who again fought in the First World War and is most famous for that. But in 1898, at the end of the year before Christmas, he visited the Holy Land, Palestine. So he was granted permission in order to build a Lutheran church, first and foremost in Jerusalem for, essentially German Protestant pilgrims. But secondly, he wanted to visit the holy places himself as a Christian, as a Protestant Christian. And he did so. But most importantly, who he met was actually Theodor Herzl. And all these Zionists would approach him and they said, look, can the newly created German Empire, which was only, I believe at this point, because the German Empire and the unified Germany was only quite young. It was only made on the 18th of August, 1866. So it's 32 years of age. And Theodor Herzl, as well as many prominent Zionists at the time, approached Kaiser Wilhelm and they asked, well, can you facilitate some sort of autonomy for us here? But the Germans never ended up, because mind you, the Jews, most of them spoke German. Jews were, of course, Yiddish is in some ways like a derivative of German, or at least it has lots of German influences there. So it's a very interesting truth how, despite the fact that it was the British elites that created this new flavor of Zionism, which they then exported onto the Mandate of Palestine and that particular land, which they took as spoils of war from the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. If you told the British people, the regular folks, the regular voters and the regular citizens and servants of the crown in the British Empire, anyway, even in the colonies, right, around the world, because the British Empire was the largest state by territory at the time. In the 1900s, if you ask them, well, do you support the creation of the State of Israel? Many of them would probably answer, I don't know what you're talking about, or they would answer negatively, because this was, even among British people, Jews were mostly seen as Yiddish, Germanized people, even though Ashkenazi itself literally means German Jew, because according to their particular theory, one of the descendants of Noah, named Ashkenaz, he migrated to the European continent. He settled around these lands, Poland and Germany. And so, therefore, the Talmudic tribe, which then lives in these particular lands, these lands belonging to Ashkenaz, should be called according to and Ashkenaz himself wasn't even, according to their own tradition, wasn't even a Semite. So Ashkenazi Jew just literally means German Jew. And so many regular British people, and by the way, they were spreading Germanophobia in Britain during the First World War. They were calling the Germans Huns and all these other, words in order to stir up hatred, just as they're doing today, for example, when you see they're promoting the terms orcs when used to describe Russia, or they transplant maps of the Middle Earth made by J.R.R. Tolkien onto the map of Europe, and you have the East, which is Mordor, clearly, right? The Russians attacking Ukraine, etc., and Ukraine is Gondor, for example. It's really quite fantastical, but you do see this creation, dehumanization of the enemy is quite a common tactic. And so the regular British people would actually probably distrust the majority of Jews within Europe during and before World War I. And because Jews was associated with Germany, who was portrayed as an enemy in the media. But yet the British elites, they knew it was up, because Britain itself already had at least one, if not, obviously multiple Jewish ministers, including Lord Rothschilds themselves, right? That family. But also Benjamin Disraeli was a Sephardic Jew. So, and he was a prime minister of Britain in the 1800s. And he was incredibly, I would say, influential under Queen Victoria and her long reign. So there was Jewish influence in Great Britain among the elites, among the lords and the aristocracy. These literally the Anglo-Saxon high cultured society was already they knew that, the Jewish elites were not living in these hovels and various ghettos among Poland and Germany. The real power was in the city of London itself. But the regular folks had no idea. They just thought Jews were just agents of Germany, for example, just like gypsies were in Romania. It's quite interesting to see how the Jews, they tried to, Theodor Herzl in particular, as an individual, as someone who tried to create a homeland in Palestine, to take something from the local people. And who knows, Theodor Herzl himself, he probably was even of less violent inclinations than Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel today. That's the thing we don't really appreciate, how things have degraded, how radically and drastically. Like, who knows if Theodor Herzl would even sort of approve of what's happening today. And I'm not trying to defend his particular sort of Talmudic, quasi-secular ideas of the creation state of the state of Israel, but just for reference, like today we live in literally an excessive version of what even probably some crazed Talmudic scholars would have thought of in the 1900s and obviously 1800s. But truth, sort of moving forward for history, the Balfour Declaration, 7th of November 1917, you have the US essentially and the British Empire heavily investing in the creation of this state. And you have mass migration after the First World War, especially with the rise of so-called anti-Semitism in Europe, all these right-wing people coming to power between World War I and II, including National Socialists in Germany, and of course in Romania as well. You have many members of the Talmudic community migrating to the Mandate of Palestine. And, at this point, sort of obviously the fiefdom of the British Empire and trying to establish life there. And then suddenly you have this rise of terrorism locally against Arab Palestinians who obviously are not even, they don't have agency, by the way. And this, unfortunately, no one asked, including not the British, nor the French, nor the rich Jews, nor of course the Rothschilds. Nobody asked the local Bedouins or the local city dwelling and village dwelling Arab Palestinians, including even the wealthiest members of the society, what their thoughts were about migrating hundreds of thousands of people into their particular community. And by the way, it's not like the migration of hundreds of thousands and as we know today, millions of Jews into a particular land was foreign. It wasn't. It happened in the past. For example, when the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, as many as, some people estimate, officially 300,000 Jews moved from Spain to the Ottoman Empire back then. That was 500 years ago. That's a huge number of people. Even by today's standards, that's quite enormous. And, prospectively, as many as 500,000 moved from Christian countries to the Ottoman Empire back then in the late 1400s. And so it wasn't completely
Then what were
unknown
they
yet.
up to? What were they up to while they got expelled from Spain and Portugal? Did they just go peacefully migrate over to, say, North Africa or maybe to America or somewhere else? Well, no, they actually then began the piracy trade, right? You had Moses Cohen, a famous pirate, and also, Columbus, the Jew himself, Sephardic Jew himself, along with his financiers. They went about, looking to discover a new world, but also robbing ships and eventually getting into the transatlantic slave trade that the Jews would pioneer and lead and make a massive fortune off of. And those profits they would then convert into, of course, establishing banks. So this way they could pursue, their ambition of wanting to control monetary systems of, various countries around the world. So they never forget, those countries that did expel them. And they're absolutely the ones that they seek to target later on when they're in positions of authority later, which is, what they seek to do. They have this vindictive nature, and exactly how it was for Russia, because they never forget, for instance, what may have happened with the Khazarian Empire, which is broken up by Count Vladimir. And so, which is back then, today would end up being modern day Ukraine. And it's not Ukraine that's pursuing this conflict against Russia, by seeking to wipe out the ethnic Russian population, sitting on what should be part of Russia anyway, as always has been part of Russia, because Ukraine's never had established borders until 1991. So they're quite the vindictive bunch. What I was going to tell you this fun tale about, again, back to mindset, that, well, it was based on fabrications of this book that tells us, that 3,000 years ago, this land was promised to us. Are you aware that Mordecai Noah said the same thing about America? He believed that the Native Americans in America were lost like descendants of the original tribes of Israel, and therefore that the Jews have a biblical claim to American land because the Native Americans have lived there the whole time. He actually believed that. He was making this proclamation. But of course, he wasn't in quite that position of authority, though he was like a diplomat, author with some sway, some persuasion. But he actually believed that natives on the land there were originally Jews, and therefore, the Jews of the world have a biblical right to be able to build a Jewish state in America. It's fact. It's documented. And they would make the same claim later towards Palestine because it didn't work. They failed to do it in America because, this barren land's not going to work out for us. And, we're not going to, there's just too many moving parts. Americans are not going to budge. Well, back then, there were mainly Brits, later Irish, that would move there, still kind of developing that sense of American culture, rebellious against the British Empire. So that failed. And that's when they had to change their ambition, their pursuit to a different homeland, which they would pursue essentially two at the same time. Because in 1897, two major occurrences took place. One was, of course, the Zionist Manifesto being released, and two was the establishment of the Jewish Bund League that would then, develop into this global, call it this global pursuit of, pushing their communist ideology in different countries around the world, where they would assign leadership in each country to go and build communities to later then go revolt against the establishment there to try to push, communist ideology, under the guise of wanting to do good by the oppressed workers who weren't getting their fair pay, etc. But in fact, the Jews had no such goal of ever, wanting to offer the workers any type of fair pay, proper work conditions, health benefits, insurance. No, they nothing of the sort. We saw this within the gulags where, they enslaved 18 million Russians and killed off, 1.7 million and under torturous conditions. So we see what the real mindset was. But again, by way of deception, by way of, gaslighting and deceiving, the audiences and those willing to listen to them, they would, because, you have to give credit where credit's due. Some of them were very good orators. The likes of Trotsky, excellent orator. Vladimir Jabotinsky, he was a law school dropout, orator, author, poet, etc. He could have been, some say he was as talented to become, a famous Russian author. He could have been possibly somewhere along the realms of maybe a Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. But unfortunately, he didn't, pursue his talents or develop his talents in that sense. He decided once he met officially with Theodor Herzl just before he died, I think it was around 1903, he died in 1904, he'd already been dead set on Zionism, but what he didn't like was this slow development of Zionism developing into, as you put it earlier, having to sort of be fair to the inhabitants of the land, not just, migrate in by force and take the land and, take ownership of it and then enslave the inhabitants of the land remaining, or basically just ethnically cleanse and kill them at the same time. He just wanted to fast forward to the end result. We want to take this state over. We're not going to recognize any borders or any type of partition plan. We're going to make it our own. Going to create the Jewish state, even though we don't have the numbers. We're going to establish a Jewish majority. And if that means we got to kick out the Muslims and Christians on the land, so be it, by force. Whereas Herzl and maybe some of the other Zionists weren't quite so aggressive with their ambitions, Vladimir Jabotinsky absolutely was. He felt really slighted with a chip on his shoulder, and he was hell-bent on getting this done ASAP, and he's willing to do whatever it takes, including, persuading the British and also using the Italians as well. A lot of people don't know, like you and I discussed this earlier, that Vladimir Jabotinsky, Ziv Jabotinsky, established a bond and a partnership with Mussolini. People think that Mussolini was just, anti-Semite the whole time. In fact, he was hosting Jews, Ziv Jabotinsky and the Zionist Jews, in Italy and helping them develop their naval academy and their army and training them and providing them with arms for many years. There was a naval academy established in Italy until 1938. So when people think that, Jews somehow figured out how to become armed and dangerous and they just magically developed their paramilitary groups, it's absolutely false. They had help from the Italians. They served in the British armies as well. Prior to even having that partnership with Italy, we know that Ziv Jabotinsky, helped establish 3 Jewish battalions that actually served in World War I with the British because they were fighting the Ottomans as well, because they, of course, in their minds, wanted to liberate the Ottoman Empire. And we know that Ziv Jabotinsky also lived in the Ottoman Empire. He actually helped establish the Young Turks media newspaper. He was a writer. He was a chief editor of the Young Turks, spreading his propaganda BS. Because once the Young Turks had invaded the Ottoman Empire, their goal was to, of course, break it up, and they would achieve that goal of course, World War I, and then through Sykes-Picot start divvying up the various Arab states into the modern states that you see today. There was no Saudi Arabia back in the day, or Jordan. You, of course, had Egypt, but you didn't have, say, the Levant split up into Lebanon and Syria and Palestine. It was all just one region. It was through the efforts of Ziv Jabotinsky, with the help of the British, that they were able to establish these battalions. And of course, we know what happened as well. You mentioned in the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So who's really financing Zionism based on who that letter was authored to, and that was, of course, Lord Rothschild. From, of course, the British foreign minister at the time, Lord Balfour, who indicated that yes, there was basically a promissory note to deliver the land of Palestine to the Jews in exchange for what the Jews had really done for the British, which was to get the Americans involved in World War I, because otherwise the British were actually willing to concede to the Germans by 1916. They were losing the war. Germany hadn't been invaded. They'd barely been touched. They'd done very well. Of course, Russia was dealing with its internal conflicts at the time, and that would eventually lead to the invasion of the Judeo-Bolsheviks to destroy that country from within. And then within the Ottoman Empire, of course, by then you had legitimate Jewish battalions that were fighting against the Ottomans to break up that empire at the same time. These are the aspects of history nobody realizes. They really went out of their way to break up empires. They did the same to, of course, the Prussian Empire as well. They did it to Russia. They did it to the Ottoman Empire. And, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 4 European empires were destroyed. People wonder why not the British Empire. Because, well, they already owned that one. They took that one over fully in 1815. They already established their English central bank. They had breeding rights as well. They've had it for like 200 years now. So they're breeding within the royal family. They own major lands. They control the monetary system. They control the politicians. They control the media.
They circumcised the king himself, which is...
They did. Yeah. Yeah. So they had full control of the British Empire. And so they broke up the other 4 that they didn't like. So this way, in pursuit of eventually then taking the land of Palestine.
Thank you for listening to this free segment of the Aether Hour. For the full subscriber-only episode, make sure to check out our World War Now Substack in the video description. In the complete episode of TruthTeller, we discuss the effects of Israel's creation in the Middle East, the origins of Zionist terrorism, and what led to the October 7th event. When you subscribe to the Substack, you also get access to 90-plus premium episodes, as well as exclusive articles and book chapters. We again thank you for your support.